The grand ballroom of the Rockefeller mansion buzzed with excitement. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits as New York's elite gathered for what promised to be the social event of the season. Waiters weaved through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne flutes that sparkled like liquid gold. At the center of it all stood Alexander Rockefeller, heir to one of the city's oldest fortunes, his arm draped possessively around the waist of a woman who. Laura Mendoza's eyes darted nervously around the room, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress, a stunning creation that probably cost more than she used to make in a year. Just 6 months ago, she had been serving drinks to people like this, not rubbing elbows with them at engagement parties. The weight of the massive diamond on her left hand still felt foreign, a constant reminder of how drastically her life had changed since the day Alexander Rockefeller had walked into her diner. "Darling, you look absolutely breathtaking," Alexander whispered in her ear, his warm breath sending a shiver down her spine. "I can't wait to make you my wife." Laura forced a smile, trying to quell the butterflies in her stomach. She loved Alexander with all her heart, but sometimes she couldn't shake the feeling that she was living someone else's life, a life she didn't quite deserve. Across the room, Richard Rockefeller watched the young couple with a furrowed brow, his crystal tumbler of scotch clutched tightly in his hand. There was something about Laura that had been nagging at him ever since Alexander had brought her home. A familiar glint in her eyes, the curve of her smile, it all stirred memories he'd thought long buried. "Richard, darling, do try to look a little less like you're attending a funeral," his wife, Clara, chided gently as she approached. "This is supposed to be a celebration." Richard cleared his throat, forcing his features into a more neutral expression. "Of course, my dear. I'm just processing it all. Our boy, getting married. And today, a waitress?" Clara finished, her perfectly manicured eyebrow arching. "I know it's not the match we expected, but Alexander loves her. And she seems like a lovely girl." "Lovely, yes," Richard murmured, his eyes once again drawn to Laura. "But there's something about her. I can't quite put my finger on it." Before Clara could respond, a hush fell over the crowd as Alexander clinked his glass, calling for everyone's attention. The young man's face was alight with joy as he gazed adoringly at Laura. "Friends, family, esteemed guests," he began, his voice carrying easily through the vast room. "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate our engagement. I know some of you were surprised when I announced my intention to marry Laura." A ripple of polite laughter coursed through the crowd. "But from the moment I saw her, I knew she was the one. Love doesn't care about bank accounts or social standing. It sees straight to the heart, and Laura's heart is the most beautiful thing I've ever known." A chorus of "AWWS" filled the air, and Laura blushed deeply, looking up at Alexander with eyes full of adoration. But as she scanned the room, her gaze locked with Richard's for a brief moment. An inexplicable chill ran down her spine, and she quickly looked away. Richard downed the rest of his scotch in one gulp, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. He was being ridiculous. Laura was just a girl from a humble background who had captured his son's heart. Nothing more. And yet, as the night wore on, Richard found himself unable to stop watching Laura. The way she moved, the musical lilt of her laugh, it all seemed hauntingly familiar. When she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture was so achingly reminiscent of someone from his past that he nearly dropped his glass. "Mr. Rockefeller?" Laura's voice jolted him from his thoughts. She stood before him, a tentative smile on her face. "I just wanted to thank you for this beautiful party. It's more than I ever could have dreamed of." Richard forced a smile, even as his heart raced. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. "It's our pleasure, my dear. Welcome to the family." Laura's smile faltered for just a moment, as if she had caught the hint of hesitation in his voice. "I know this must be an adjustment for you and Mrs. Rockefeller. I want you to know that I truly love your son. I'm not after his money or—" "Of course not," Richard cut her off, perhaps a bit too sharply. He softened his tone. "Alexander has always had excellent judgment. If he loves you, that's good enough for me." Laura nodded, relief washing over her features. As she turned to rejoin Alexander, Richard caught a glimpse of a small birthmark just behind her ear. a distinctive crescent shape that made his blood run cold. It couldn't be. It was impossible. And yet, Richard's mind raced back to a summer nearly 25 years ago. A torrid affair with a beautiful hotel maid named Maria. The way she had disappeared without a trace, leaving nothing but a broken heart and a lingering sense of guilt. He had tried to find her, but it was as if she had vanished into thin air. With trembling hands, Richard pulled out his phone and quickly typed out a message to his most trusted private investigator. Need background check on Laura Mendoza. Urgently, particularly interested in mother, possibly named Maria. Utmost discretion required. As he hit send, Richard looked up to see Alexander twirling Laura on the dance floor, both of them laughing with carefree abandon. The sight, which should have warmed his heart, now filled him with a creeping sense of dread. If his suspicions were correct, the fairy tale romance that had captured New York's imagination was about to become a nightmare of Shakespearean proportions. And Richard Rockefeller found himself at the center of a ticking time bomb, one that threatened to destroy not just his family, but the very foundations of the empire he had spent his life building. As the music swelled and champagne flowed, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this glittering engagement party was not the beginning of a beautiful new chapter, but the first domino in a chain of events that would shatter lives and unearth long-buried secrets. Little did he know, the truth was far more explosive than even his worst fears could have imagined. The morning after the engagement party, Laura Mendoza awoke in a bed that still felt too large, too soft, too everything. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a room bigger than her childhood home. She stretched, her hand brushing against the cool sheets where Alexander should have been. "Babe?" she called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. The door to the ensuite bathroom opened, and Alexander emerged, already impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Laura's old car. He smiled, and Laura's heart did a little flip. Even after 6 months, she still couldn't believe this gorgeous, kind man had chosen her. "Good morning, Sleeping Beauty," Alexander said, crossing the room to plant a kiss on her forehead. "I didn't want to wake you. You looked so peaceful." Laura sat up, clutching the silk sheets to her chest. "What time is it? Don't you have that board meeting today?" Alexander checked his watch, a timepiece worth more than most people's annual salary. "In about an hour. I thought I'd let you sleep in. Last night was intense." Laura's mind flashed back to the engagement party, the scrutinizing gazes, the whispered comments, the palpable disapproval from some of New York's elite. She had felt like an exotic animal on display at the zoo. "Your father," Laura began hesitantly. "I don't think he likes me very much." Alexander's brow furrowed. "Don't be silly. Dad's just old-fashioned. He'll come around once he gets to know you better." He sat on the edge of the bed, taking Laura's hand in his. "Hey, I have an idea. Why don't you come to the office with me today? We can have lunch, and I can show you around the empire you'll be marrying into." Laura's stomach did a nervous flip. The thought of stepping into the intimidating world of Rockefeller Enterprises made her palms sweat. But she forced a smile. "Sure, that sounds great. Just let me get ready." As Alexander left for his meeting, promising to send a car for her later, Laura sank back onto the bed, overwhelmed by the surreal turn her life had taken. Just months ago, she had been working double shifts at a greasy spoon diner, scraping by to help her mother with the bills. Now, she was engaged to one of New York's most eligible bachelors, living in a penthouse that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Laura's thoughts drifted to her mother, Maria. She hadn't told her about the engagement yet, partly because she knew her mother would be thrilled, but also because a small part of her feared that this dream would shatter if she spoke it aloud. With a sigh, Laura reached for her phone and dialed the familiar number. "Mommy," she said when her mother answered. "I have some news." Meanwhile, across town in his opulent home office, Richard Rockefeller stared at his computer screen, his face ashen. The private investigator had worked quickly, compiling a preliminary report on Laura Mendoza's background. What Richard saw made his blood run cold. Laura's mother was indeed named Maria Mendoza. She had worked as a maid at the very hotel where Richard had stayed during that fateful summer 25 years ago. The dates aligned perfectly with their affair. But it was the next piece of information that made Richard's world tilt on its axis. Laura's birth certificate listed no father. It can't be, Richard muttered, his hands shaking as he poured himself a stiff drink, not caring that it was barely 10 a.m. She can't be. A soft knock at the door made him jump. Richard? Clara's voice called out. Are you all right? You missed breakfast. Richard quickly closed the laptop. Fine, darling. Just some unexpected business matters. Clara entered, her perfectly coiffed appearance a stark contrast to Richard's disheveled state. She frowned, taking in the tumbler of scotch and her husband's haggard expression. Richard, what's going on? You've been acting strange ever since Alexander announced his engagement. She paused, her eyes narrowing. Is this about Laura? I know she's not from our world, but... It's not that, Richard cut her off, perhaps too sharply. He softened his tone. I'm sorry, Clara, I have some concerns about the company. Nothing for you to worry about. Clara didn't look convinced, but she nodded slowly. All right. Oh, I almost forgot, Alexander called. He's bringing Laura to the office today. I thought we could all have lunch together. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. The thought of sitting across a table from Laura, knowing what he now suspected, made him feel physically ill. But he forced a smile. Sounds lovely, dear. As Clara left, closing the door behind her, Richard slumped in his chair. He had to know for sure. He had to speak with Maria Mendoza. With trembling fingers, he dialed his private investigator again. I need an address for Maria Mendoza. And I need it now. Across the city, in a modest apartment in Queens, Maria Mendoza hung up the phone, her heart racing with a mixture of joy and trepidation. Her Laura, engaged to a Rockefeller. It was like something out of a fairy tale. And yet, Maria's eyes drifted to an old shoebox tucked high on a shelf in her closet. Inside were mementos of a summer long past, faded photographs, love letters, and a small velvet box containing a pair of diamond earrings. Gifts from a man she had loved fiercely, briefly, and ultimately, tragically. She had never told Laura the truth about her father. How could she? The pain of that summer, of the impossible choice she had made, still ached like a phantom limb even after all these years. But now, with Laura about to marry into the very family that had unknowingly shaped both their destinies, Maria felt the carefully constructed walls of her past beginning to crumble. Dios mío, she whispered, crossing herself. Please, protect my daughter. Protect our secret. Little did Maria know, fate had already set in motion a chain of events that would bring long-buried truths explosively to light. Back at Rockefeller Enterprises, Alexander proudly led Laura through the gleaming corridors of power. Everywhere they went, employees stopped to stare, whispering behind their hands as soon as the couple passed. And this, Alexander said, throwing open a set of imposing oak doors, is the boardroom. One day, you'll be sitting at this table, helping to shape the future of the company. Laura's eyes widened as she took in the cavernous space, dominated by a massive table of polished mahogany. Me? But I don't know the first thing about running a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Alexander laughed, pulling her close. You'll learn. I'll teach you everything you need to know. He kissed her softly. Together, we're going to take this company to new heights. As they broke apart, Laura caught sight of a portrait hanging on the wall. A stern-faced man with piercing eyes that seemed to follow her around the room. Is that my great-grandfather? Alexander confirmed. The original Rockefeller, quite the intimidating figure, isn't he? Laura nodded, unable to shake the feeling that those painted eyes were judging her, finding her wanting. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the door opening behind them. Well, a cold voice drawled. If it isn't the happy couple. Laura whirled around to find herself face to face with a statuesque blonde woman whose icy blue eyes were fixed on her with undisguised contempt. Veronica, Alexander said, his voice tight. I didn't realize you were in town. Clearly, the woman, Veronica, replied, her gaze never leaving Laura. Aren't you going to introduce me to your fiancé? Alexander cleared his throat. Laura, this is Veronica Astor. Her family's company is one of our biggest partners. Veronica, this is Laura Mendoza, my fiancé. Veronica's perfectly manicured hand shot out, gripping Laura's in a handshake that was just shy of painful. Charmed, I'm sure. Tell me, Laura, how does a simple waitress manage to land one of New York's most eligible bachelors? Laura felt her cheeks burn. We just connected. Sometimes love just happens. Veronica's laugh was like shards of glass. Oh, sweetie, love might just happen in fairy tales, but in our world? There's always an angle. She turned to Alexander, her tone softening. We simply must catch up, darling. Dinner tonight? For old time's sake? Before Alexander could respond, the boardroom doors burst open once more. Richard Rockefeller strode in, looking harried and slightly wild-eyed. He stopped short at the sight of the trio. Dad, Alexander said, surprise evident in his voice. I thought you were taking the day off. Richard's eyes darted between Alexander, Laura, and Veronica, a myriad of emotions flickering across his face. There was an urgent matter I needed to attend to. His gaze settled on Laura, and she felt a chill run down her spine. Laura, my dear, might I have a word with you? In private? Laura glanced at Alexander, who looked as confused as she felt. Of course, Mr. Rockefeller. As Richard led her out of the boardroom, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking towards something monumental, a turning point from which there would be no return. Behind them, Veronica watched with a calculating gleam in her eye. Well, she murmured to Alexander. Isn't this turning out to be an interesting day? Richard ushered Laura into his private office, closing the door firmly behind them. Laura's heart raced as she took in the opulent surroundings, the walls lined with rare books, the priceless art, the view of the Manhattan skyline that took her breath away. Please, sit, Richard said, gesturing to a leather armchair that probably cost more than her old apartment. Laura perched on the edge of the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mr. Rockefeller, if this is about the engagement, I want you to know that I truly love your son. I'm not after his money or... Richard held up a hand, silencing her. This isn't about Alexander, at least, not entirely. He paced behind his desk, running a hand through his silver hair. Laura, what do you know about your father? The question caught her off guard. My father? I never knew him. My mother raised me alone. Richard nodded, as if confirming something to himself. And your mother, Maria, she never spoke of him? Laura's brow furrowed. How do you know my mother's name? Richard froze, realizing his mistake. He turned to face Laura, his expression a mixture of guilt and something else. Fear? Laura, there's something I need to tell you. Something that may change everything. Just as he opened his mouth to continue, a commotion erupted outside the office. The door flew open, revealing a disheveled woman with wild eyes. Mommy? Laura gasped, jumping to her feet. Maria Mendoza stood in the doorway, her chest heaving as if she had run a great distance. Her eyes locked with Richard's and the color drained from her face. Richard, she breathed. After all these years. Laura's head swiveled between her mother and her future father-in-law, confusion etched on her features. What's going on? How do you two know each other? Richard sank heavily into his chair, looking older and more vulnerable than Laura had ever seen him. It's time for the truth to come out, he said softly. All of it. As Maria stepped into the office, closing the door behind her, the air crackled with tension. Outside, the New York sky darkened, as if nature itself was bracing for the storm that was about to break. In that moment, standing between the man she had never known and the woman who had raised her, Laura felt the foundations of her world begin to crumble. Whatever was about to be revealed, she knew with bone-deep certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The tension in Richard Rockefeller's office was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Laura's eyes darted between her mother, Maria, and Richard, her mind racing to make sense of the situation. The silence stretched on, broken only by the muffled sounds of the bustling city below. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. Laura, Maria, please, sit down. What I'm about to tell you will change everything. Maria moved to stand protectively next to her daughter, her hand resting on Laura's shoulder. Richard, por favor, she pleaded. Think about what you're doing. But Richard's resolve seemed to harden. No, Maria. It's time. We can't keep this secret any longer. He turned to Laura, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and something that looked almost like longing. Laura, 25 years ago, I met your mother. We had an affair. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Laura felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. It was a summer I'll never forget. I was younger then, unhappily married to Clara. Your mother, she was like a breath of fresh air. We fell in love, but you were a coward, Maria interjected, her voice sharp with decades-old pain. You chose your money and your status over love. Laura's head was spinning. She turned to her mother, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mommy? Is this true? Maria's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. Mieha, I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I thought it was better this way. To protect you from the pain, from the scandal. The implications of what they were saying slowly dawned on Laura. She felt as if she might be sick. Are you saying that you're my father? She asked Richard, her voice trembling. Richard nodded slowly, unable to meet her eyes. I didn't know. Not until recently. When Alexander brought you home, there was something familiar about you, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't until I saw that birthmark behind your ear, the same one Maria has, that I began to suspect. Laura's hand flew to the crescent-shaped mark behind her ear, a feature she'd always thought was just a quirk of nature. Now, it felt like a brand, marking her as part of a scandalous secret. This can't be happening, Laura muttered, standing up so abruptly that her chair toppled backward. Do you know what this means? Alexander. Oh God, Alexander is my half-brother, Richard finished, his voice heavy with regret. The room seemed to spin around Laura. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if Maria hadn't caught her. I think I'm going to be sick, she mumbled. Just then, a knock at the door made them all freeze. Dad? Alexander's voice called out. Is everything okay in there? You've been gone a while, and I saw Mrs. Mendoza come in. Richard, Maria, and Laura exchanged panicked looks. Just a moment, son, Richard called out, his voice strained. He turned to Laura and Maria, speaking in an urgent whisper. We need time to figure out how to handle this. For now, we say nothing to Alexander or anyone else. Agreed? Laura wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare. But she found herself nodding mechanically. Maria squeezed her hand, a silent promise of support. Richard smoothed down his tie and took a deep breath before opening the door. Alexander stood there, concern etched on his handsome face. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw Laura and Maria. What's going on? He asked, looking between the three of them. Richard forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Nothing to worry about, son. Mrs. Mendoza just dropped by to discuss some wedding details with Laura. Isn't that right, Laura? Laura felt as if she were moving through molasses as she nodded, avoiding Alexander's gaze. Right, just wedding stuff. Alexander's brow furrowed, clearly not buying the explanation. But before he could press further, a commotion in the outer office drew their attention. Veronica Astor's voice carried through the open door, sharp with anger. What do you mean, I can't go in? Do you know who I am? Richard's assistant's placating tones were drowned out as Veronica burst into the office, her icy blue eyes taking in the scene before her. Her gaze lingered on Laura and Maria, a calculating gleam in her eye. Well, isn't this cozy? She drawled. A family meeting, perhaps? How quaint. Alexander stepped forward, placing himself between Veronica and the others. Veronica, this isn't a good time. Perhaps we could reschedule our meeting? But Veronica wasn't deterred. She sauntered further into the room, her stilettos clicking ominously on the hardwood floor. Oh, I think this is the perfect time. After all, we're all friends here, aren't we? Her tone suggested anything but friendship. Or maybe, more than friends? Laura felt a chill run down her spine at Veronica's words. Did she know something? Or was she just fishing, hoping to stir up trouble? Richard cleared his throat, his businessman's mask sliding firmly into place. Veronica, I apologize, but we are in the middle of a private family matter. If you could give us a moment. Family matter? Veronica's eyebrow arched delicately. How interesting. I wasn't aware that the help was considered family now. Her gaze swept dismissively over Laura and Maria. Alexander's jaw clenched. That's enough, Veronica. I think you should leave. Now. For a moment, it looked like Veronica might argue. But then she smiled, a predatory grin that made Laura's skin crawl. Of course, darling. Far be it from me to intrude on family time. She turned to leave but paused at the door. Oh, and Laura? Do be careful, dear. The higher you climb, the farther you have to fall. With that parting shot, she was gone, leaving a wake of tension behind her. Alexander turned back to the group, frustration evident on his face. Okay, someone needs to tell me what's really going on here. And don't say it's about wedding details, because I'm not buying it. Laura felt panic rising in her chest. She couldn't lie to Alexander, not about this, not about anything. But how could she possibly tell him the truth? That the woman he loved, the woman he was planning to marry, was actually his half-sister? Maria stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Alexander, there are complications. Things that need to be discussed. But not here, not like this. Alexander's gaze softened slightly at Maria's words, but the confusion and hurt in his eyes were plain to see. Laura, he said, reaching for her hand. Whatever it is, we can face it together. You know that, right? Laura felt tears welling in her eyes. She wanted nothing more than to fall into Alexander's arms, to wake up from this nightmare and find that it was all just a bad dream. But the reality of their situation crashed over her like a tidal wave. She pulled her hand away, unable to bear his touch. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Alexander. I can't do this right now. Before anyone could stop her, Laura bolted from the room, pushing past a startled Veronica who was lingering in the outer office. She ran blindly through the corridors of Rockefeller Enterprises, ignoring the startled looks of employees and the calls of her name behind her. She didn't stop running until she burst out onto the busy New York street, the cacophony of traffic and pedestrians a welcome distraction from the turmoil in her mind. Laura leaned against the cool stone of the building, trying to catch her breath and make sense of how her life had imploded in the span of mere minutes. Back in Richard's office, chaos erupted in Laura's wake. Laura, Alexander made to go after her, but Richard caught his arm. Son, wait. There are things you need to know. Alexander wrenched his arm free, his eyes flashing with anger. What I need is to go after my fiancée. What the hell did you say to her? Maria stepped between them, her small frame somehow commanding attention. Please, both of you, stop. This situation, it's complicated. We need to approach it carefully. What situation? Alexander demanded. Will someone please tell me what's going on? Richard sank heavily into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his years. Alexander, sit down. There's something I need to tell you about Laura, about our family. As Richard began to speak, his voice heavy with regret, none of them noticed Veronica slipping away from the outer office, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. She had only caught snippets of the conversation, but it was enough. Scandal was brewing in the house of Rockefeller, and Veronica Astor intended to be there when it all came crashing down. Laura wandered the streets of New York in a daze, oblivious to the curious glances thrown her way. Her designer dress and tear-streaked face made for an odd sight among the bustling crowds of Midtown Manhattan. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the bombshell that had been dropped on her. Richard Rockefeller, her father. Alexander, her half-brother. The fairy tale romance she thought she'd been living had twisted into a nightmare of Shakespearean proportions. Without realizing it, her feet had carried her to Central Park. Laura found a secluded bench and collapsed onto it, finally allowing the sobs she'd been holding back to overtake her. How had everything gone so wrong? Just this morning, she had been on top of the world, engaged to the man of her dreams, about to join one of the most powerful families in New York. Now she was lost, adrift in a sea of lies and betrayal. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Laura's sobs subsided into quiet hiccups. She knew she couldn't hide forever. Sooner or later, she would have to face the mess her life had become. But for now, she allowed herself this moment of solitude, watching as the park slowly emptied of joggers and tourists. The sound of approaching footsteps made her tense, ready to flee again if necessary. But the voice that called out to her was achingly familiar. "Laura? Dios mío, I've been looking everywhere for you." Maria hurried towards her daughter, her face etched with worry. She sat down next to Laura, wrapping her in a fierce embrace. "Mi hija, I'm so sorry. So sorry for everything." Laura didn't pull away, but she didn't return the hug either. "Why, Mommy?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Maria sighed, her arms tightening around Laura. "I thought I was protecting you. Richard, he made his choice all those years ago. He chose his wife, his family, his empire. I didn't want you to grow up feeling like you weren't enough, like you had been rejected. So instead you let me fall in love with my own brother?" Laura's voice cracked on the last word. "I never imagined this would happen," Maria said softly. "When you told me about Alexander, I convinced myself it had to be a different Rockefeller. That fate couldn't be so cruel." She pulled back, cupping Laura's face in her hands. "If I had known, Mia more, I would have told you everything. You have to believe me." Laura wanted to be angry. She wanted to scream and rage at her mother for keeping this secret, for letting her walk blindly into this impossible situation. But looking into Maria's tear-filled eyes, all she could see was the woman who had sacrificed everything to give her a good life. "What do we do now, Mommy?" Laura asked, feeling very much like a little girl again, wanting her mother to have all the answers. Maria brushed a strand of hair from Laura's face, her touch gentle. "We face this together, Mi hija. Whatever comes, we face it as a family." As they sat there, mother and daughter reunited in their shared pain, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of a nearby tree. Veronica Astor lowered her phone, a triumphant smile playing on her lips as she reviewed the photos she had just taken. The tearful reunion, the intimate conversation, it was all captured in high-definition glory. "Oh, Laura," Veronica murmured to herself. "You really should be more careful about where you have your breakdowns. You never know who might be watching." With one last glance at the oblivious pair on the bench, Veronica melted back into the growing darkness of the park. She had a story to craft, and by the time she was done, the Rockefeller empire would be shaken to its very foundations. Back at Rockefeller Enterprises, Alexander sat in stunned silence, trying to process the bomb his father had just dropped on him. Richard watched his son anxiously, waiting for some kind of reaction. "Alexander, son? Please, say something." Alexander's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Say something? What do you want me to say, Dad? That it's okay that you had an affair? That I'm fine with the fact that the woman I love, the woman I was going to marry, is actually my sister?" Richard flinched at the venom in Alexander's voice. "Half-sister," he corrected weakly, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left his mouth. Alexander shot to his feet, pacing the office like a caged animal. "Half-sister, sister. What difference does it make? Do you have any idea what you've done? To me? To Laura? To this family? I know I've made mistakes, son. Terrible mistakes. But you have to understand." "Understand what?" Alexander roared, slamming his hands down on Richard's desk. "That you couldn't keep it in your pants? That you've been lying to all of us for years? That you've ruined my life and Laura's in one fell swoop?" Richard stood, reaching out to his son. "Alexander, please. We can figure this out. We can." But Alexander recoiled from his father's touch as if it burned. Don't touch me. I can't even look at you right now." With that, Alexander stormed out of the office, leaving Richard alone with the wreckage of his past mistakes. The older man slumped in his chair, burying his face in his hands. How had it all gone so wrong? And more importantly, how could he ever make it right? As the night settled over New York City, four souls wrestled with the fallout of a decades-old secret finally brought to light. Laura and Maria, finding solace in each other's company in the growing darkness of Central Park. Alexander, driving aimlessly through the city streets, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. And Richard, alone in his office, haunted by the ghosts of his past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Little did they know, the worst was yet to come. For in the shadows, Veronica Astor was crafting a story that would shake New York society to its core. The Rockefeller scandal was about to break, and when it did, no one would be left unscathed. As the city that never sleeps buzzed with its usual nighttime energy, a storm was brewing, one that threatened to destroy everything the Rockefellers had built, and tear apart the lives of those caught in its path. The stage was set for a drama of epic proportions, a tale of love, betrayal, and redemption that would be talked about for years to come. And at the center of it all, a young woman who had dared to dream of a fairy tale ending, only to find herself trapped in a nightmare of Shakespearean proportions. The clock was ticking, secrets were unraveling, and in the unforgiving world of New York's elite, the fall from grace was about to begin. The sun rose over New York City, its golden rays painting the skyline in hues of pink and orange. But for the Rockefeller family and those caught in the web of their secrets, the new day brought no comfort, only the harsh reality of their shattered world. Laura awoke on her mother's worn couch, her eyes puffy from a night of fitful sleep and tears. For a blissful moment, she forgot the events of the previous day. Then, like a tidal wave, it all came crashing back, the revelation, the hurt, the impossible situation she now found herself in. "Mommy?" she called out, her voice hoarse. Maria appeared from the tiny kitchen, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. "Here, hija," she said softly, pressing the warm cup into Laura's hands. "Drink this. You need your strength." Laura took a sip, the bitter liquid a stark contrast to the sweetness of her old life. A life that now seemed like a distant dream. "What do we do now, Mommy?" she asked, echoing her question from the night before. Maria sat beside her daughter, her face etched with lines of worry and regret. "We face this, Laura. Together. But first," she hesitated, then continued, "first, you need to talk to Alexander." The mere mention of his name sent a jolt of pain through Laura's heart. Alexander, the man she loved, the man she could never have. Her brother. The word felt foreign, wrong. "How can I face him, Mommy?" Laura whispered, tears threatening to spill once more. "How can I look him in the eye knowing what we know?" Maria wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "With courage, more. And with truth, it's all we have left." As Laura nodded, steeling herself for the impossible conversation ahead, across town, another drama was unfolding. Alexander Rockefeller had not slept. He had spent the night driving aimlessly through the city, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. As the sun rose, he found himself parked outside his father's mansion, the house he had grown up in, now tainted by lies and betrayal. With a heavy heart, he made his way inside. The house was quiet, the staff not yet stirring. Alexander moved through the familiar halls like a ghost, memories of happier times haunting his every step. He found his father in the study, slumped over his desk. Empty glasses and a half-empty bottle of scotch told the tale of Richard's own sleepless night. "Dad," Alexander said, his voice devoid of emotion. Richard's head snapped up, hope and fear warring in his bloodshot eyes. "Alexander, son, don't." Alexander cut him off, holding up a hand. "I didn't come here for apologies or explanations. I came because we need to figure out how to handle this mess you've created." Richard nodded, straightening in his chair. Despite the disheveled state of his clothes and the obvious signs of a night spent drowning his sorrows, he attempted to summon the air of the powerful businessman he had always been. "Of course," he said, his voice rough. "We need to contain this. If word gets out." "If word gets out?" Alexander's laugh was hollow, bitter. "Dad, do you really think we can keep this a secret? Laura is my fiancée, was my fiancée. People are going to ask questions when the engagement is suddenly called off." Richard's face paled. We could say it was mutual. That you realized you weren't compatible." "Stop it." Alexander slammed his hand on the desk, causing Richard to flinch. "Stop trying to spin this like it's just another business problem you can solve with money and influence. This is our lives, Dad. Real people, real emotions." For a moment, Father and son stared at each other across the vast mahogany desk, a physical manifestation of the gulf that had opened between them. Then, slowly, Richard's shoulders slumped. "You're right," he said softly. "I'm sorry, Alexander. I've spent so long trying to protect this family, this legacy. I've forgotten what really matters." Alexander's anger deflated slightly at the sight of his father, the man he had idolized for so long, looking so defeated. He sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "What do we do, Dad?" he asked, echoing Laura's earlier question. "How do we move forward from this?" Before Richard could answer, a sharp knock at the study door made them both jump. Clara Rockefeller, Alexander's mother, swept into the room, her face a mask of concern. "Richard? Alexander? What on earth is going on?" I heard raised voices, and she stopped short, taking in the scene before her, the empty glasses, her husband's disheveled appearance, her son's haunted eyes. "What's happened?" Richard and Alexander exchanged a look of shared dread. In all the chaos, they had forgotten about Clara, the innocent party in all of this, about to have her world turned upside down as well. Richard stood, moving towards his wife. "Clara, my dear, please, sit down. There's something I need to tell you." Across the city, in a luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park, Veronica Astor sat at her computer, a satisfied smirk playing on her perfectly painted lips. The article on her screen was a masterpiece of innuendo and half-truths, sprinkled with just enough fact to make it devastating. "Rockefeller romance rocked. Secret love child scandal threatens empire," the headline blared. Veronica's fingers hovered over the send button. With one click, she could unleash this bombshell on New York society, bringing the mighty Rockefellers to their knees. It was everything she had ever wanted, revenge for years of feeling second best, of watching Alexander choose a nobody waitress over her. And yet, a small voice in the back of her mind gave her pause. Was this really who she wanted to be? A destroyer of lives, a merchant of misery? As if on cue, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Alexander, a simple message that made her heart skip a beat. "Veronica, I need to see you. It's important." For a moment, Veronica allowed herself to hope. Had Alexander finally come to his senses? Realized that she, not Laura, was the one he was meant to be with? With a decisive click, she closed the article draft. The story could wait. For now, there were more important matters to attend to. Laura stood outside the door to Alexander's penthouse, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the neighbors could hear it. She had agonized over this moment all morning, what to say, how to say it. In the end, she had decided that there were no right words for a situation like this. All she could do was be honest and hope that somehow, someway, they could find a path forward. Taking a deep breath, she raised her hand to knock. But before her knuckles could make contact with the wood, the door swung open. Alexander stood there, looking as haggard as she felt. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, a universe of unsaid words hanging between them. "Laura," Alexander finally breathed, her name a prayer and a curse on his lips. "Alexander," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Can I come in?" He stepped aside wordlessly, allowing her to enter the apartment they had once planned to share as husband and wife. Now, it felt like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of their shattered dreams. They moved to the living room, neither quite able to look the other in the eye. Laura perched on the edge of the sofa, while Alexander remained standing, his body tense as if ready to flee at any moment. "I'm so sorry," Laura began, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I never meant for any of this to happen. If I had known." "Known what?" Alexander cut in, his voice sharp. "That you were my sister? That our entire relationship was built on a lie?" Laura flinched at the bitterness in his tone. "Half-sister," she corrected weakly, immediately regretting the words. Alexander laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Right. Because that makes it so much better." "I didn't know, Alexander," Laura pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "You have to believe me. I would never have, if I had known." Alexander's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. He sank into an armchair, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I know, Laura. I know you didn't know. It's just, God, how did we end up here? Laura wanted nothing more than to go to him, to take him in her arms and tell him everything would be all right. But she couldn't. That door was closed to them now, locked by the cruel twist of fate that had made them siblings. What do we do now? She asked softly, echoing the question that seemed to be on everyone's lips. Alexander met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow that broke Laura's heart all over again. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know how we come back from this. How we face our friends, our family, the world. As if on cue, Alexander's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his brow furrowing. It's Veronica, he said. She says she has something important to tell me. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. Veronica Astor had never made a secret of her dislike for Laura, or her own interest in Alexander. If she had somehow gotten wind of the scandal. Alexander, Laura said urgently, I think Veronica might know something. Last night, in your father's office, the way she was looking at us. I think she suspects. Alexander's face hardened. If she knows, if she's planning to use this information. He stood abruptly. I need to go see her. Try to contain this before it spirals out of control. Laura nodded, understanding but hating the necessity of it. As Alexander moved towards the door, she called out, Alexander? He paused, looking back at her. I love you, she said simply, her voice breaking on the words. I know I shouldn't, I know it's wrong now, but I can't just turn it off. I'm sorry. Alexander's expression softened, a glimmer of the man she had fallen in love with shining through the pain and confusion. I love you too, Laura. God help me, but I do. And I'm sorry too, for everything. With that, he was gone, leaving Laura alone in the apartment that should have been their home, surrounded by the remnants of the life they would never have. Veronica paced her penthouse, alternating between checking her phone and glancing at the article still open on her computer. Alexander was on his way. This was her chance, perhaps her last chance, to win him back. A knock at the door sent her heart racing. She smoothed down her dress, checked her reflection one last time, and went to answer it. Alexander stood in the hallway, looking more disheveled than Veronica had ever seen him. But even in his current state, he was breathtakingly handsome. Veronica felt her resolve strengthen. She would save him from this scandal, be his rock in the storm. And in return, he would finally see that she, not Laura, was the one he was meant to be with. Alexander, darling, she purred, stepping aside to let him in. I'm so glad you came. I have something very important to discuss with you. Alexander's eyes narrowed as he entered the penthouse. What's this about, Veronica? If you know something. Veronica's smile was all innocence. Know something? Whatever do you mean, darling? I simply wanted to see you. To offer my support in these trying times. She moved to her computer, Alexander following warily behind. With a flourish, she pulled up the article she had crafted. You see, I couldn't help but overhear some rather distressing rumors. About you, about Laura, about your father. Alexander's face paled as he scanned the headline, the color draining from his cheeks. Veronica, he said, his voice low and dangerous, what have you done? Veronica placed a hand on his arm, ignoring the way he tensed at her touch. Nothing, darling, not yet, but you have to understand, if I've heard these rumors, others will too. It's only a matter of time before this all comes out. She leaned in close, her voice a seductive whisper. But it doesn't have to be this way, Alexander. I can help you. We can get ahead of this story, spin it in our favor. Together, we can weather this storm. All you have to do, is choose me. For a moment, Alexander didn't move. Veronica held her breath, certain that she had won, that he would finally see the truth of their destined love. Then, slowly, deliberately, Alexander removed her hand from his arm. When he looked at her, his eyes were cold, harder than she had ever seen them. You're blackmailing me, he said flatly. It wasn't a question. Veronica's eyes widened in feigned innocence. Blackmail? Oh no, darling. I'm offering you a lifeline. A way out of this mess. Don't you see? Laura can never be yours now. But I can be everything you need. Alexander stepped back, disgust evident on his face. "You're wrong, Veronica. About everything. Laura may not be able to be my wife, but she will always be a part of my life. She's my family now, in a way you could never understand." He moved to the computer, his finger hovering over the delete key. "As for this article, go ahead. Publish it, tell the world, because I'd rather face this scandal head-on, with my family by my side, than spend one more second pretending to be something I'm not." With a decisive click, he deleted the article draft. Veronica gasped, lunging for the computer, but it was too late. Her carefully crafted exposé was gone. Alexander turned to her, his expression a mixture of pity and resolve. "Goodbye, Veronica. I hope someday you find whatever it is you're looking for. But it won't be with me. It never was." As the door closed behind Alexander, Veronica sank to the floor, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. She had played her final card, and lost everything in the process. Outside, Alexander leaned against the wall of the elevator, his heart pounding. He had done it, faced down Veronica's threat and chosen his own path. It wasn't the life he had imagined, but it was his. And for the first time since the shocking revelation, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the elevator descended, carrying him back to the complicated reality of his new life, Alexander made a decision. It was time to face the music. Time to tell the world the truth, on his own terms. It wouldn't be easy, but with Laura, his father, and yes, even his mother by his side, they would weather this storm. The Rockefeller empire might never be the same, but maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the ashes of their old life. Something real, something honest, something worth fighting for. As Alexander stepped out into the bright New York sunlight, he took a deep breath. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in days, he felt ready to face it. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as a family. The Rockefeller mansion, once a bastion of power and privilege, now felt like a powder keg ready to explode. In the grand living room, the family had gathered, Richard, Clara, Alexander, and Laura, each lost in their own thoughts as they waited for the storm to break. Clara sat rigidly on the edge of an antique settee, her face a mask of barely contained fury and hurt. The revelation of Richard's affair and the existence of Laura had shattered her world, leaving her reeling and unsure of her place in the family she thought she knew. "I still can't believe it," she said, breaking the tense silence. Her voice was brittle, like glass about to shatter. "All these years, Richard. All these years of lies." Richard, looking older and more defeated than ever, reached for his wife's hand. Clara jerked away as if burned. "Clara, my dear, I know I've hurt you beyond measure. But please, believe me when I say that I never meant for any of this to happen." Clara's laugh was harsh, devoid of any humor. "Never meant for it to happen? You had an affair, Richard. You fathered a child. Those aren't things that just happen." Laura, who had been silent until now, spoke up softly. "Mrs. Rockefeller, Clara, I'm so sorry. If I had known, I never would have." Clara's gaze snapped to Laura, softening slightly as she took in the young woman's obvious distress. "It's not your fault, dear," she said, her voice gentler now. "You're as much a victim in all this as the rest of us." Alexander, who had been pacing by the window, turned to face the group. "We can't change the past," he said, his voice firm. "What's done is done. The question is, what do we do now?" Richard straightened, a glimmer of his old authority returning. "We need to get ahead of this story. If we control the narrative, we can minimize the damage to the company, to our reputation." "Is that all you care about?" Clara interrupted, her eyes flashing. "Your precious company? Your reputation? What about our family, Richard? What about the damage you've done to us?" The room fell silent, the weight of Clara's words hanging heavy in the air. It was Laura who finally broke the tension, her voice small but determined. Maybe this is a chance," she said, looking around at the faces of her newfound family. "A chance for honesty, for a fresh start. We can't change what happened, but we can choose how we move forward." Alexander moved to stand beside Laura, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. The gesture, once so natural, now felt charged with a new, complicated energy. Laura's right, he said. We've lived with secrets and lies for too long. It's time for the truth, whatever the consequences. Richard nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of resignation and relief. You're right, both of you. It's time to face the music. He turned to Clara, his eyes pleading. I know I have no right to ask this of you, but, will you stand with me? With us? As a family? Clara looked around the room, at her husband, broken but seeking redemption, at her son, standing tall despite the weight on his shoulders. At Laura, the daughter she never knew she had, offering a chance at a new beginning. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. For the family, she said softly. Not for you, Richard. Not yet. But for our son, for Laura. For the future of the Rockefellers. I'll stand with you. As if on cue, the sound of car doors slamming and a commotion outside broke the moment. Alexander rushed to the window, his face paling at what he saw. Reporters, he said grimly. Dozens of them. Looks like the story's already breaking. Richard stood, straightening his tie in a reflexive gesture. Then we face it head on. Together. As the family moved towards the front door, ready to face the media circus that awaited them, Laura felt a hand slip into hers. She looked up to find Alexander beside her, his eyes full of a complex mixture of emotions. Whatever happens out there, he said softly, know that I don't regret a single moment with you. We'll figure this out, Laura. Somehow. Laura squeezed his hand, fighting back tears. Together, she whispered. With a deep breath, Richard opened the front door. Camera flashes exploded in their faces as reporters shouted questions, their voices a cacophony of accusation and speculation. Mr. Rockefeller, is it true that Laura Mendoza is your illegitimate daughter? Alexander, how long have you known your fiancée was actually your sister? Mrs. Rockefeller, did you know about your husband's affair? Richard held up his hands, somehow commanding silence despite the chaos. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, he began, his voice steady. We have called this impromptu conference to address the rumors that have been circulating. What I'm about to tell you will shock many of you, but we believe in transparency and honesty. As Richard began to speak, laying bare the secrets that had torn their family apart, Laura felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. This was it, the moment of truth. There would be no going back after this. But as she stood there, surrounded by her newfound family, Laura realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a future waiting for them on the other side of this storm. It wouldn't be the future she had dreamed of, but it would be real. It would be theirs. The press conference stretched on, a grueling ordeal of questions and accusations. But through it all, the Rockefellers stood united. Clara, her face a mask of dignified strength. Alexander, his voice steady as he spoke of forgiveness and moving forward. And Laura, finally able to claim her place in the family, no longer a secret to be hidden away. As the last of the reporters filed away, promises of follow-up interviews and exclusive stories hanging in the air, the family retreated back into the mansion. They were exhausted, emotionally drained, but there was also a sense of catharsis. The truth was out, the worst was over, or so they thought. Just as Richard was about to close the door, a figure pushed through the lingering crowd. Veronica Astor, her face a study in barely contained fury, stormed up the steps. How dare you? She hissed, her eyes flashing as she faced the family. You think you can just come clean, play happy families, and all will be forgiven? You have no idea what you've done. Alexander stepped forward, placing himself between Veronica and his family. Veronica, please. It's over. The truth is out. There's nothing left for you to expose. Veronica's laugh was cold, brittle. Oh, Alexander, you always were naive. This isn't just about your little family scandal. This is about the empire you've built on lies and deception. And I promise you, I will not rest until I've torn it all down. Before anyone could respond, Veronica spun on her heel and stalked away, leaving a wake of tension behind her. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. What did she mean by that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating. I'm afraid, he said slowly, that our troubles may be far from over. As the family retreated into the house once more, the weight of Veronica's threat hanging over them. They knew that the storm they had weathered was perhaps only the beginning. The truth was out, yes, but the consequences of decades of secrets and lies were only just starting to unfold. In the coming days, weeks, and months, the Rockefeller family would face challenges they had never imagined. Their empire would be shaken to its very foundations. Longtime allies would turn their backs, fair-weather friends would disappear, and enemies would circle like vultures, eager to pick at the carcass of their once mighty legacy. But as Laura looked around at the faces of her newfound family, at Alexander, her brother and the love she could never have, at Clara, the stepmother she was only beginning to know, at Richard, the father who had been absent for so long, she felt a fierce determination take root in her heart. They had survived the revelation of their deepest, darkest secret. They had faced the world and owned their truth. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced this, together, as a family. The road ahead would be hard, fraught with legal battles, public scrutiny, and personal struggles. The Rockefeller name, once synonymous with power and prestige, would be tarnished, perhaps irreparably. But from the ashes of their old life, a new kind of strength was emerging, one built on honesty, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds of family. As night fell over the Rockefeller mansion, the family gathered in the living room once more. No words were spoken, none were needed. They simply sat together, drawing comfort from each other's presence, steeling themselves for the battles to come. Laura, looking out at the twinkling lights of the city she had once viewed as a fairy tale kingdom, now saw it for what it truly was, a jungle, beautiful but dangerous, where only the strongest survived. And in that moment, she made a silent vow. She would be strong, for herself, for Alexander, for the family she had only just found. The Rockefeller empire might fall, their name might be dragged through the mud, but they would endure. They would rebuild, stronger and more united than ever before. And one day, they would rise again, not as the untouchable titans of industry they once were, but as something far more valuable. A real family, bound by love, truth, and the shared experience of weathering life's fiercest storms. As Laura felt Alexander's hand slip into hers, a gesture of sibling support rather than romantic love, she allowed herself a small smile. The future was uncertain, yes, but for the first time since this whirlwind began, she felt ready to face it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As Rockefellers, as a family. 1 year had passed since the day the Rockefeller family's secrets had been laid bare before the world. 1 year of struggles, of rebuilding, of learning to be a family in the face of adversity. The mansion that had once been a symbol of their untouchable status now stood as a testament to their resilience. Laura stood by the window of what had become her room, looking out at the New York skyline. So much had changed, and yet, the city remained eternal, indifferent to the dramas that played out within its concrete canyons. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. "Come in," she called, turning to see Alexander enter, a tentative smile on his face. "Hey sis," he said, the words still carrying a hint of strangeness even after all this time. "You ready for today?" Laura nodded, smoothing down her simple but elegant dress. "As ready as I'll ever be. I still can't believe we're doing this." Alexander crossed the room, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. The touch, once electric with romantic potential, now carried the warmth of familial love. "It's time," he said softly. "We've hidden away long enough. The world is waiting." Together, they made their way downstairs, where Richard and Clara were waiting. The past year had aged Richard visibly, the stress of legal battles and public scrutiny etching new lines on his face. But there was a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a contentment born of honesty and redemption. Clara, for her part, stood tall and proud. The scandal had nearly broken her, but she had emerged stronger, a pillar of strength for the family in their darkest hours. "You both look wonderful," Clara said, embracing first Alexander, then Laura. The gesture, once unthinkable, now felt natural, a mother's love extending to the daughter she had never known she had. Richard cleared his throat, emotion making his voice rough. "I know this past year hasn't been easy on any of us, but I want you all to know how proud I am of your strength, your forgiveness, your love. We're not the family we once were, but we're the family we were always meant to be. Laura felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been a waitress dreaming of a fairy tale. Now, she was a Rockefeller, with all the complexity and responsibility that entailed. The sound of car horns outside signaled that it was time. The family moved as one to the front door, pausing for a moment before stepping out into the bright New York day. The street was lined with reporters and curious onlookers, all eager to catch a glimpse of the Rockefellers as they made their first official public appearance since the scandal broke. Camera flashes exploded as they descended the steps, but this time, there was no fear, no shame. They faced the world united, a family forged in the fires of adversity. Richard stepped up to the microphones that had been set up, Clara at his side, Alexander and Laura flanking them. The crowd fell silent, waiting. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice strong and clear. "A year ago, we stood before you and laid bare the secrets that had torn our family apart. Today, we stand before you again, not as the untouchable Rockefellers of old, but as a family reborn." He paused, looking at each member of his family with undisguised love and pride. "We have faced challenges this past year that we never could have imagined. We've lost friends, business partners, social standing. But what we've gained is far more valuable: truth, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family." Clara stepped forward, her voice joining Richard's. "We are here today not to ask for your forgiveness or understanding, but to show you that there is strength in vulnerability, power in honesty, and hope in new beginnings." Alexander spoke next, his eyes meeting Laura's as he did. "My sister and I have learned that love comes in many forms. The love we once thought we had for each other has transformed into something deeper, something unbreakable. We stand here not as star-crossed lovers, but as siblings united by blood and shared experience." Finally, it was Laura's turn. She took a deep breath, facing the sea of cameras and curious faces. "A year ago, I was Laura Mendoza, a waitress with dreams of a fairy tale life. Today, I stand before you as Laura Rockefeller, proud of my heritage, of my family, of the woman I've become through this journey." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Our story is not a tragedy, as some have painted it. It's a story of redemption, of second chances, of the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. We are not perfect, but we are real. And we are family." As Laura finished speaking, a strange thing happened. From somewhere in the crowd, a single pair of hands began to clap. Then another joined in, and another. Soon, the air was filled with applause, a spontaneous outpouring of support that brought tears to Laura's eyes. In that moment, she knew that they had turned a corner. The scandal that had threatened to destroy them had instead forged them into something stronger, something unbreakable. The press conference continued, questions were asked and answered with honesty and grace. But for Laura, it all passed in a blur. Her focus was on her family, on Richard, the father she was still getting to know, on Clara, the stepmother who had opened her heart in ways Laura never expected, on Alexander, her brother, her best friend, her strongest supporter. As the event wound down and the family prepared to return to the privacy of their home, Laura felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find a young woman, barely out of her teens, looking at her with wide, admiring eyes. "Miss Rockefeller," the girl said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say, your story, it gave me hope. I've been struggling with some family issues of my own, and seeing you all up there, so strong and united, it made me believe that maybe there's hope for us too." Laura felt her heart swell. She took the girl's hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "There's always hope," she said softly. "Always. As long as there's love, there's hope." As the family made their way back into the mansion, Laura lingered for a moment on the steps. She looked out at the city, at the world that had once seemed so vast and intimidating. It was still vast, still challenging, but no longer intimidating. She was Laura Rockefeller now. Daughter, sister, survivor. And whatever the future held, she would face it with her family by her side. The door closed behind her, shutting out the noise of the city. Inside, Richard, Clara, and Alexander waited, their faces alight with love and pride. This was her family now. Imperfect, complicated, but bound by ties stronger than blood or scandal. As they gathered in the living room, glasses of champagne raised in a quiet toast to new beginnings, Laura felt a sense of peace settle over her. The fairy tale she had once dreamed of might have turned out to be an illusion, but the reality she now lived was far richer, far more meaningful than any fantasy. She was home, she was loved, she was a Rockefeller. And that, she realized, was the happiest ending of all.